From the Edge Media Studios in downtown Indianapolis, this is Indiana Issues. Here's your host, Abdul-Hakim Shabazz.
Hello and welcome to Indiana Issues, the public affairs program where we try to go beyond the headlines and sound bites and bring you Indiana's newsmakers and Indiana's issues in their entirety. I'm your host, Abdul-Hakim Shabazz, the editor and publisher of IndyPolitics.org. Well, Indiana lawmakers are near the halfway point, so we'll talk about that. Also, Justice Stephen Breyer steps down, and the mayor talks about crime. And so we got a good panel of new folks this time around. Former City County Councilor Colleen, Rima, Shahid of Women's for Change, and of course our old friend Mark Rutherford, former head of the Libertarian Party. Well, my friends, let's go ahead and get started. It is halftime at the Indiana General Assembly. Lawmakers are continuing their work on tax cuts, on employer vaccine mandates, and also critical race theory legislation and some other items. And so, Mark, we're going to start with you, my friend. How do you think lawmakers are doing so far?
Oh, it's going about the way it usually does. There's a lot of upsettedness. There's a lot of indecisiveness. There's a lot of stuff going and being talked in the background. I find it kind of hard to predict and grade a General Assembly till it gets closer to more and more bills being passed. But I would say they're doing about a C, and for a libertarian to say that, that's probably as good as I'm ever going to get.
Rima, Shahid, Women for Change, how do you think lawmakers are doing so far?
I think it's unfortunate. The fact is that people are still grappling with COVID-19, unemployment, still a lot of uncertainty. And instead of talking about how we can make sure that people are safe, how we can make sure that people have jobs, we are trying to govern schools and how teachers can teach about our history. And that's a fact. I think it's very unfortunate that we're in the position that we're in. And this attack that we have on schools in Marion County, instead of focusing on larger issues, I'm glad that Mark's giving it a C. I'm probably go down to a D at this point.
Colleen Fanning, former City County Councilor, how do you think your colleagues across the other end of Market Street are doing so far in this short session?
I kind of give them mixed reviews right now. I mean, I do give Speaker Houston and Speaker Pro Tem Breyer some credit. They are moving some things along, but there's also some notable things we probably should be discussing that we're not. For instance, Representative Zimke's very comprehensive cannabis legalization bill. It's really time we have that kind of conversation. Regardless of what your stance on that is, we shouldn't be the last state in the Midwest to open the dialogue on that. So I have some feelings about that amongst other things.
Mark Rutherford, there are some big differences right now between the House version and Senate version on things. The House has moved forward with $1 billion worth of tax cuts. The Senate decided to drop their tax cut bill. Also, there's vaccine mandates where the House has moved forward with their employee vaccine exemptions. The Senate just basically passed a bill that would lift the governor's emergency order, but not do the vaccine exemptions. And also issues on, so let me ask you this. Let's start right there. Do you think lawmakers can work out their differences? Because it's not like, they want to spend $1 billion here and they want to spend, $500 million here. So we'll meet in the middle at $750 million.
Well, they do work out differences. Sometimes they don't. But the real thing that has really mystified me is the $1 billion tax cuts in the House, which as a libertarian, I think we spend way too much of the citizens' money, and we'd be better off being a lot tighter budget. So I'm kind of happy with some tax cuts. The Senate saying no, and it's almost like we're not going to do it, is what I'm hearing almost from them. And it's like, wait a minute, this is very perplexing, especially when we have supermajorities of the Republicans there. And we've heard for years and years and even decades that the Republicans would be the ones that would cut taxes more and more. So the House seems kind of more legit to that position. And the Senate, though, because of its longer term lengths of terms, tends to be a little bit more conservative from the standpoint of taking their time to do things, not whether they're not from a political sense. But the almost like no answer just really perplexed me.
Rima, let me ask you, do you think Indiana lawmakers can work out their differences? Because like I said, it's not like we're like, this wants to spend this much money, this group wants to spend the other amount of money. We'll meet in the middle.
I think what we're seeing this session is a continuation of what we saw in 21, in which there was quite literally a family feud. You have a supermajority, and yet they continue to have this infighting between the legislative and executive branch in 21 mostly. And now there seems to be a fight even within the legislative branch. To your point, Abdul, they are continuing to try to limit Governor Holcomb's executive powers. But it almost, from a distance feels like, well, you didn't take out the trash, so I'm not emptying the dishwasher. And I think we need to rise above this level of family feud to get things done, especially during a short session. To be not being able to compromise and meet on actual numbers in a short session, it takes time away from the real issues.
And Colleen, I thought Rima made an interesting analogy. Like, I won't take out the trash. Well, I won't do the dishes. Well, I won't feed the kids. Well, I won't go to work. What do you think is going to happen with our lawmaker friends at the State House?
You know what, Rima, that was a great analogy. I was going to compliment you on that because it's perfect. Yeah, this is the problem when you have a supermajority, right? I mean, there's a lot of family feuds. I mean, we've seen it at every level of government. Supermajorities generally aren't that productive. So that's a big point of frustration, particularly when we are looking at tax cuts that are desperately needed. I mean, Indiana as a state is economically very strong. We have a surplus. So it's absolutely time to return some more money to the people and stimulate our economy and get everything moving again so we can be even stronger. The state, our economy as a whole, but also families can start to rebuild after what was really difficult dealing with COVID for the past 2 years.
Obviously, like I said, we got lawmakers going through lots of legislation, lots of different things right now. Which one, and Colleen, we'll start with you. What legislation would you not like to see passed? What do you think is bad for the state of Indiana as a whole?
Right now, I mean, I don't think anything, I don't have any one specific thing on the table that's bad. I'm mostly just concerned that they get the things on the table across the finish line and then address some of the things like Rima alluded to and I alluded to earlier that aren't being addressed at all. And we need to start having these big conversations about marijuana, I'm always about the lane mile ratio. I'll talk about that later if you let me, Abdul. But yeah, for me, it's more about what's not getting done rather than what's maybe going to get to the finish line.
Rima, let me ask you, what legislation do you think lawmakers should just be staying away from and avoiding altogether?
Well, how much time do we have, Abdul? I guess that's my first question.
Just know this is a half-hour program, so.
Okay, so I'm going to have to limit that down. I think that we need to put Hoosiers first. And we need to really listen. When people are going into that building and making their voices heard on a particular issue, lawmakers really need to take that into consideration. I don't know if that's really happening. I don't know if folks are really listening and hearing, or they're just going through the exercise of letting people testify, but ultimately voting a long party vote. House Bill 1134 on education matters would be detrimental to future generations of Hoosiers. House Bill 1041 on banning young students from participating in school sports and not making sure that we have strict laws around guns in our state, especially after what's happened in other states. I think that these are kind of some of the issues that are top of my mind right now, given the fact that I only have a limited amount of time, but we can talk offline about other bills.
Mark Rutherford, it's only a half-hour program, and you're a Libertarian, so what issues would you...
I'll try to be succinct and narrow here. The biggest thing to me, which is the poster child for things gone wrong, is this legislation trying to be pushed through and then worked on about soda pop and putting limits on that and how much you can charge, et cetera, et cetera. And as a Libertarian, I want as much of a free market as possible. As a Libertarian, I tend to be more supportive of things that show inequities of power, and that can be defined and can be defined to be unrealistic. But this is clearly one where just let the market exist on that. And it's soda pop, my goodness. I drink it, but I probably shouldn't do as much as I do for the standpoint of water's pretty darn good, but I kind of like the caffeine in it. So that's what I do it. But the whole point is, you don't mess with that. That's playing favorites. And that's what the General Assembly does way too much. And legislators do way too much. The executive does to some extent. And so it's a real problem with that. And so that's it. There's lots of things I could complain about. The cannabis legalization not being really given what it needs to be given. Lots of regulations on vape shots, et cetera, where I see tons of evidence where in vaping, it's helping stop people from smoking cigarettes. Vaping's not as good as not doing it, probably, at least in my opinion, but it's not as harmful as a lot of things we do, including drinking bourbon and scotch. And it's helping people get rid of something that has been shown to have a lot of bad effects, which is cigarette smoking. So why is that becoming harder and harder to deal with more regulations that make it expensive for businesses and don't make good sense in the broad scheme of things.
Our guests on the program today are Libertarian Mark Rutherford, Rima Shahid of Women for Change, and former Indianapolis City County Councilor, Republican Colleen. You're watching Indiana Issues, coming to you from the Edge Media Studios in downtown Indianapolis. I'm your host, Abdul-Hakim Shabazz. Well, folks, as we approach the deadline to file the Indiana primary, a number of incumbent lawmakers are facing challenges, particularly Todd Young, who has a challenge from Danny Niederberger, more conservative, and obviously dealing with some issues of signatures and the whole 9 yards. Mark, let me start with you. What does it mean for so many lawmakers to have so many challenges?
The challenges for them is that they've got to work really hard just to get on the ballot for the Republican or Democrat Party, and they've got to deal with the other people challenging what they're doing and why they're doing it. So from a pure standpoint of if you're an incumbent, you don't want to have to deal with that. You just want to have to deal with the general election. Hope the primary is pretty easy. But it shows to me what I've been saying for a very long time, and that is the politics of the United States is realigning. One of the reasons I think that a lot of incumbents are seeing opposition is there's not the consensus within the parties as there once was, and there's actually change. People I thought would never vote Republican are voting Democrat or Libertarian. People I never thought would vote anything but a Democrat are voting Republican and Libertarian. These interest groups are reshifting, realigning with other groups, and who knows where it's going to end up at. And incumbents being challenged with some people who could be fairly serious challengers, if not the winners, is a sign of that, in my opinion. One of the signs.
Colleen, let me ask you, a lot of lawmakers, particularly Republican lawmakers in the legislature, are getting conservative, ideological Republican lawmakers are getting a lot of primary challenges. What do you think is going on there?
Well, it's our system is so tricky, right? Because the primary pushes people to be, the furthest right or the furthest left they can be. And then you have to pivot and try to win a general and come back to the middle. And it's just a really unfortunate system, I think, because in my experience, at least, 80% of us agree on about 80% of the issues. So we're pushing people to these fringes to try to win these primaries. And, you look at somebody like Danny Niederberger, who's challenging Senator Todd Young. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with primary challenge. It keeps elected officials sharp. I mean, it holds them accountable. I'm fine with that. But, last time I checked, I have more name ID than Danny Niederberger, and I'm not running for Senate. So I don't think there are necessarily a lot of, really robust challengers. It'll be interesting, but it certainly does take resources away from the general. And it can really kind of throw a candidate off their message. So it's tricky. It's tricky.
Rima, let me ask you, do you think these challenges are the result of, obviously we just went through redistricting, we have new maps out there. Do you think a lot of these challenges are the result of these new legislative maps that have been drawn?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you asked that question, Abdul, because that's exactly where I was heading. Last year, Women for Change commissioned a study by Dr. Christopher Warshaw, who is an independent professor out of Georgetown University. His study has never been rebutted. A lot of people didn't like his study, but nobody has ever challenged it. So like to put that out there always. And that's what his study showed, is that extreme partisan gerrymandering does lead to more polarization, to Colleen and Mark's point. And that's what we're seeing more and more, is that we have more polarizing candidates. To Colleen, your point, majority of Hoosiers agree on an issue, yet the folks that are either challenging an incumbent or ultimately winning, as we know from a few lawmakers in the State House right now, they don't necessarily represent the party that they align themselves with. And that's unfortunate, because these people don't represent their constituents. They're there just causing a whole lot of nonsense and not necessarily getting anything done. And that's what you have with this partisan gerrymandering. Dr. Christopher Warshaw's study also showed that Indiana's current and former maps were more partisan gerrymandered than any other state enacted in the United States over the past 50 years. And I'll just let everyone sit with that for a moment while you get the next question teed up, Abdul.
No problem. Mark, let me ask you, do you see any incumbents particularly vulnerable here in the state of Indiana? Like I said, you're a Libertarian, you got contacts all across the state. Yes. Any particularly vulnerable incumbents this go around?
I'm not going to predict any of that, except for where we have two prior incumbents that have been put into the same district. And we're going to have some very interesting fights in those areas. What I will be comfortable saying at this point in time is We're going to have some incumbents lose primary challenges, and it's going to surprise all of us. I don't have the crystal ball to say what won, but what I can see without a crystal ball is it's very volatile out there. And when we've got people upset about the COVID policies, both pro, con, neutral, et cetera, we have a mix. It's all over the place for everything, emergency powers, what the legislature should be doing. And that suggests to me that we're going to have a couple, three people talk about 2022 being not as bad for the Republicans as Watergate was in 1974, but we're going to have some comparable surprises, in my opinion, like that, just not as broad and as much as we did then. And I'm old enough to remember that. And so.
Our guests on the program today are Libertarian Mark Rutherford, Rima Shahid of Women for Change, and former Indianapolis City County Councilor, Republican Colleen. We're going to take ourselves a quick break. When we come back, Justice Stephen Breyer basically saying he's stepping down, so we'll talk about the U.S. Supreme Court and crime in the city of Indianapolis and predictions and prognostications from our panel as well. You're watching Indiana Issues coming from the Edge Media Studios in downtown Indianapolis. I'm Abdul-Hakim Shabazz. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Indiana Issues. I'm your host, Abdul-Hakim Shabazz, the editor and publisher of IndyPolitics.org. Our guests on the program today are Libertarian Mark Rutherford, Rima Shahid of Women for Change, and former Indianapolis City County Councilor Colleen Fanning. Mark, Rima, Colleen, the U.S. Supreme Court making news this week. Justice Stephen Breyer announced that after nearly 30 years in the court, he is stepping down. Justice Breyer was appointed back in 1994 by former Democratic President Bill Clinton. Mark, let me start with you since you're the attorney in the group. How would you describe Justice Breyer's term on the court?
Abdul, that's a very interesting question. He seemed to me to be a consensus builder among Democrats, and then reaching out among people who had been Republicans, although surprisingly enough, the Supreme Court, administratively, from what I read and hear, is surprisingly very cordial with each other. But they did come from different perspectives on how they looked at politics and how government should run, et cetera, and what certain things mean. And he had that reputation for being a consensus builder when there could be a possibility to do that. He had strong lines himself. So I don't know who will be the next consensus builder, if any, among the group in there. It does change, and we're always surprised by it. Did have the opportunity to speak with him once at an event of attorneys. Liked him tremendously, very personable, and he really reached out and even talked about his theories of how he did things. And those are the type of people you do need in there. And so I think the court's going to miss him tremendously. It may not be as good for the President Biden in picking a replacement as he might think because of Breyer's ability to do that and to reach out to others.
Rima, what do you think this means for the court's political ideology as a whole? Obviously, it's a 6-3 conservative majority, but what do you think Justice Breyer believing will do for the court's ideology?
Well, before that, Abdul, I think you'll be surprised, since you know me personally, that I found myself aligned with Senator Lindsey Graham this week when he said that elections have results. And I could not agree more, Senator Graham. We saw that happening with the former administration, and we see this happening now. I think to Mark's point, Justice Breyer was a consensus builder. He was also someone that viewed our Constitution as something that we need to align ourselves with today and not necessarily look at from a point of view of when the framework makers wrote it. But I'm very excited to have a Black woman that is going to be taking that position. I think the fact that our court, the highest court in our land, is going to look more like our nation, the fact that we're finally going to give credit to Black women that have been leading this country since its inception is very, very exciting. So for those reasons, I'm excited.
Colleen, let me ask you about the confirmation process. Do you think it'll be smooth, or relatively error-free, or do you think there'll be a pitfall out there somewhere along the line, because we are in such a polarized atmosphere these days?
Well, far be it from me to predict what elected officials are going to do, but I think we're seeing an increasingly divisive climate in Washington and the state. So I assume this is going to be sort of politics as usual. And it will be probably a hard-fought battle, which is, really unfortunate. It didn't used to be that way. I mean, Robert Vane was reminding me today that 1987 was really the first time this was a really super contentious process between then Senator Ted Kennedy and eventual Supreme Court Justice Bork. So, because Antonin Scalia had been confirmed and sailed right through just a few years before. So that's kind of when this whole thing turned. And I think it's just going to be politics as usual. I mean, as Rima said, elections have consequences. And, if President Trump were reelected from another term, I don't think we would see this resignation. So, here we are. This is the game. This is how it goes. And it's probably going to stay 6-3. And, we'll add some diversity to the court.
Our guests on the program today are Republican, former Indianapolis City County Councilor Colleen Fanny, Women for Change Director Rima Shahid, and Libertarian Mark Rutherford. You're watching Indiana Issues. I'm your host, Abdul-Hakim Shabazz. My friends, Indianapolis Mayor Joe Hogsett and IMPD have announced a new anti-crime proposal for 2022 in response to last year's major increase in the murder rate. It involves hiring more officers, peacekeepers, and investing in new technology and mental health programs. Colleen, we'll start with you as a former city county councilor. It seems like every year, every mayor sort of announces a new anti-crime program. Do you think this will work?
No. That's my short answer. This has been a huge frustration of mine. I mean, I live in Marion County. I've served my constituents for 4 years. Crime is just this never-ending boondoggle, and unfortunately, I don't think we're not seeing a lot of vision out of our leadership. I'm interested to dig into the crime bill. I haven't read it thoroughly yet, but I'm curious to see to what degree they're going to try to incorporate groups like the 10-Point Coalition and some like boots on the ground community activist groups to really kind of help IMPD with this issue. Also Senator Walker has an interesting crime bill on the table that will address things like catch and release and the bracelet issue. So I think that could be maybe more helpful than what Mayor Hogsett's proposing. But, also we can talk about this in prognostications later, but we have a really great prosecutorial candidate for Marion County in Cindy Carrasco. And, we know what's not working right now. So maybe it's time for us to look for a change.
Mark, you're also, remember searching correctly, on the Public Defender Board statewide. Your thoughts on the Mayor Crime Program, particularly from a public defender perspective?
Well, from a public defender system perspective, anything to try to help with that is fine. But from my analysis, the better public defenders you have, which they are actually all pretty darn good in Marion County, and as long as they have adequate caseloads where they can spend the time to tell the judge if their client is guilty of something, what the sentence should be and how it will keep them from repeating offending again. To me, that's where a lot of money should be spent, is to make sure that judges and prosecutors are taught by the public defender or the criminal defense attorney. They're both the same, but the private defense bar, that's what you do at a sentencing if you've been found, your client's been found guilty. What will keep them from doing it again? What's best for them? That makes a huge, huge difference. But what I hear about the Mayor Hogsett's program, and I got this from somebody else who said, oh, sounds like 10-Point Coalition, only with a layer of government interference on top of it. And I think that was a good description of it. These programs just generally don't work when they're too government-centric. I know there's some things in there to promote private groups and other groups in there, but I just think that that's not the right approach to it. There are other approaches for it. I could spend the next 45 minutes telling you those approaches. I won't bother you with that.
Not a problem, my friend. Rima Shahid, your thoughts on the mayor's latest anti-crime initiative, and do you think this will fare out any better than the previous crime initiatives that the mayor has put out?
One can hope, but I think we really need to get down to the root cause. of why crime and murders keep increasing in our city. It is the economic hub of our state, and yet we're not investing enough time and resources into why this is happening. We're trying to do things after the fact, and I'd like to spend more time on the diagnostics rather than applying something afterwards. And I think that's where the time should and resources need to be spent. But again, one can continue to hope.
One of the things, we got just a couple of seconds left here before we go to our political proclamations. And Mark, I want to get your thoughts on the Bail Project. That's a charitable, not-for-profit group that does bail mostly for indigenous folks. But the Bail Project is coming to scrutiny lately. Three people of the Bail Project helped release two committed murders, one stabbed 2 police officers. Your thoughts on the Bail Project and what should be done in that area?
Well, with the Bail Project, on paper, it's a really, really, really good idea. The problem is implementation. You've got to use a lot of common sense. And you also have to be aware that there's a lot of people who don't understand the criminal justice system because they've never been involved with it. They have just a shallow understanding of it. And so you can't be doing things by just being too easy about who you support and don't support. Like it or not, you're going to have to make a case that you're supporting people that aren't too scary first, getting them out, because there's an awful lot of people that, in my personal opinion, they'll come back to court and they probably won't do anything else because they just made a big, big mistake. They need to be dealt with the criminal justice system. Those people all too often are wasting our time, taxpayers' money in jail. How do you figure to get those out? But as you can see with the current Bail Project, some people that there's strong arguments should not have been released were released. And they just, it's what I see, and as a libertarian, I'm involved with a lot of this, and this is sometimes idealism clouds your glasses or your eyesight. And that's because you're trying to do what needs to be done, but sometimes you just got to step back and be a little bit pragmatic and say, is this the person we really want to help to release or not? At this point in time, as we're making our case that this will make things better, which I think ultimately it will. The end result is you're getting legislation to charge them the same rates as bail bondsmen and for bail insurance and all types of things from the legislators. And so the backlash was very, very strong. And that's unfortunate because I think the idea of it has great merit. It just needs to be implemented a lot better.
Colleen, I'll give you the last word on the Bail Project. Your thoughts?
I'm just going to echo what Mark said. I completely agree.
All right. Our guests on the program today are Libertarian Mark Rutherford, Rima Shahid of Women for Change, and former Indianapolis City County Councilor, Republican Colleen Fanning. Well, my friends, we come to the point in the program where we go through our political predictions and prognostications, where we ask our panel what big issues out there should the audience be paying attention to, or what issue is out there that folks aren't necessarily paying attention to. And Mark, we'll have you go first.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, my goodness. What's the big issue they're not paying attention to? And this is kind of my interest in it, and it is about executive power and emergency powers. There's getting attention, but the attention is all over the place. There's a lot of attacks and telling people that they're wrong, and legislature suing the governor striking back at the legislature. And it's clear that something needs to be done about what is appropriate emergency power. In my book, it's if a tornado hits, sometimes you have to close the road for a week to make sure everything's taken down, put back up, et cetera, et cetera. Should it last 2 or 3 years? The definition of emergency is short term in most dictionaries, immediate, something that's immediate need. To me, it's no longer emergency once you have plenty of time to sit back and figure out what to do. And that's the legislator's job and the way we've divided things and how we should do. I know it's messy and it might be a little slower than you'd like, but in the long term, I think it's better to rely upon that. And I think that's the big issue that's being missed. Gets a lot of attention, but unfocused.
Rima Shahid, what's your prediction or prognostication?
Indiana ranks 4th highest in the nation as far as reported sexual assault among high school girls. And the fact is that people are not paying attention to a House bill that has now passed the House with an 86-3 vote. It's called Elements of Rape. When we were in session in committee, the prosecutor's office, they shared that consent, the issue of consent is mentioned during every single rape trial in the state of Indiana. It is high time that we define consent in the state of Indiana, and we need to pass that House bill, which is around elements of rape. So I do encourage people to learn more about that and get that done. We owe that to the victims and to make sure that it does not happen anymore.
Colleen Fanning, your prediction, prognostication.
Okay, I'll be quick. I think Todd Young is going to sail through his primary. I think he'll probably end up swatting the mosquito with a bazooka. So that'll be interesting to watch. I think Cindy Carrasco is going to give Prosecutor Mears all he can handle and more. That should be a really interesting race to watch given all of the crime climate in Marion County right now and the lack of real solutions and real progress happening there. In fact, the opposite's happening. And lastly, I just want to make a plea for every Hoosier to care about the lane mile ratio, which our House and Senate continue to ignore, because the way funding works for roads, 92 counties wide, is that every lane mile of road gets funded at the same level, whether it's 8 lanes on Keystone or County Lane 350 dirt road in Boone County. So Marion County has 33% of the lane miles in the state of Indiana, and we get less than 11% of the funding to take care of that. So that's just a losing battle. We will never have good streets. We will never have properly safe infrastructure. So, and last time I checked, we were at like a $2.8 billion infrastructure deficit in Marion County. And that's just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger until we convince these lawmakers to give up part of their pie to help this economic engine that we all enjoy called Indianapolis. So I'm beating that drum until my last breath. Help me.
All right. Well, our guests on the program today have been Libertarian Mark Rutherford, Rima Shahid of Women for Change, and former Republican Indianapolis City County Councilor Colleen Fanning. Thank you all very much for joining us from the Edge Media Studios and all of us here at Indiana Issues. I'm Abdul-Hakim Shabazz. Thanks for joining us. We'll talk to you next time on Indiana Issues.